Abigail Mercer bent down in the dirt of the Saturday market and picked up the apples her father had just smashed under his boot. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply gathered every bruised piece with her bare hands while the crowd laughed and the summer sun burned the back of her neck. That image stopped Ethan Caldwell cold at the edge of the road. He was worth more than any man in Clover Creek, and he had never felt so worthless in his life. Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story to the very end and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Saturday market in Clover Creek ran from sunup to noon, and by 9 o'clock, the dust was already thick enough to taste. Abigail Mercer had been on her feet since 4 in the morning. She had loaded the wagon herself, carried the apple crates herself, set up the stall herself, arranged the jars of pressed cider in a row, wiped each one with the hem of her apron, and written the prices on a strip of brown paper in handwriting that was careful and even, because that was the kind of woman she was. Careful, even, steady in a way that people confused for stubbornness. She was a large woman. She had always been a large woman. Her arms were strong from years of orchard work, her hands rough and permanently stained with the faint ghost of apple skin. She wore a faded blue dress that had fit her better 2 summers ago, and she wore it anyway because there was no money for another. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She had known since she was 12 years old. She carried that knowledge, the way she carried everything else quietly, without complaint, deep in the center of herself where it couldn't slow her down. Her father, Harold Mercer, sat on a crate in the narrow strip of shade cast by the livery stable across the lane. He had a tin cup of something cold, which Abby had also prepared. He watched her with the particular expression he reserved for the market, a loose proprietary satisfaction, as if the stall and the goods and the labor were all extensions of himself, which in his mind they were. "You priced the cider too low again," he said without moving from the shade. "The price is what it needs to be," Abby said. "You give things away, Abigail. Always have. It's why we don't have more." She didn't answer that. There were 100 answers she could have given, and she had rehearsed most of them over the years, and none of them changed anything, so she had stopped speaking them aloud. The morning moved. Customers came and went. A few women from the church bought preserves and made a point of not making eye contact with Abby, directly speaking to a spot somewhere above her left shoulder. A farmer she didn't know bought 4 jars of cider and paid exactly what was asked without a word. A group of young men walked past, and one of them said something she didn't quite catch, but the others laughed, and she knew what kind of laughter it was. She kept working. Then Gerald Prentice walked up. Gerald Prentice was not a bad man exactly. He was simply the kind of man who needed an audience. He ran the feed store 2 buildings down from the market square, and he fancied himself a voice of local commerce, which meant he had opinions about prices. 3 cents for a jar of cider, he said, picking one up and turning it over like it had personally offended him. "That's steep for Mercer cider." "It's the same price as last month," Abby said. "Same as every other stand. Last month's cider sat on shelves. People have choices, Miss Mercer." "Then they're welcome to make them." Something shifted in Gerald Prentice's face, the small embarrassment of being contradicted by a woman, that particular kind of embarrassment that certain men wore like a wound. "I'm just saying," he continued louder now because there were people nearby and the volume was part of the point, "that maybe you ought to think about what draws customers. Could be the problem ain't the price." He let his eyes move over her slowly. The crowd didn't gasp. They didn't intervene. A few people looked away. A few didn't bother. Abby held his gaze. She didn't flush. She didn't flinch. She set her hands flat on the table in front of her and said in a voice that was completely level, "The cider is 3 cents a jar, Mr. Prentice. Will you be buying?" He set the jar down hard, and that was when Harold Mercer stood up from his crate. Abby heard him before she saw him. The scrape of boots, the particular rhythm of his stride when he'd decided something. She turned, and she saw his face, and she knew immediately that whatever was about to happen was going to be worse than Gerald Prentice. "You're embarrassing this family," Harold said. He wasn't talking to Prentice. "Pa, I told you to hold your tongue with customers. I told you." His voice was low and controlled, which was the version of his anger that Abby feared most. The loud version exhausted itself. The quiet version had staying power. "I was handling it," she said. "You were arguing. In public. Making a scene." He was insulting. Harold's boot came down on the nearest basket of apples. Not a stumble, not an accident. Deliberate. The basket cracked under the pressure. Apples rolled across the ground in every direction, into the dust, under boots, against the wheel of a passing cart. A jar of cider tipped and shattered. The smell of it rose up sharp and sweet and wrong in the heat. Harold straightened, smoothed the front of his shirt. "Clean that up," he said, and walked back to his shade. Abby stood still for 3 seconds. Then she crouched down and started picking up apples, one at a time, with her bare hands, from the dirt. She did not cry. She pressed her mouth into a line and worked. Around her, the market continued. A child pointed and was pulled away by a parent who shushed it. 2 women exchanged a glance over Abby's head, not unkind exactly but helpless, in that way that amounted to the same thing. Gerald Prentice was gone. He had gotten what he came for. Abby gathered the unbroken apples. She picked up the shards of the cider jar carefully because someone else could cut themselves on them. She righted the remaining jars. She wiped the table down with her apron. She did all of it without looking up, which was why she didn't see the man watching her from the edge of the road. Ethan Caldwell was 34 years old and had never in his life done anything he did not choose to do. That was the simple fact of his existence. He had been born into the kind of family where choice was assumed, where the question was never whether you could, but which way you preferred. His father had left him 12,000 acres of the best cattle land in 3 counties, a house that had been built to last a name that opened doors before he reached them. He had grown up knowing that the world arranged itself around men like him. He was not cruel about it. He had some awareness, at least, that the arrangement was not universal. But awareness and understanding are different things, and Ethan Caldwell had never had reason to close that distance. He was in Clover Creek because his foreman had sent word that the fall cattle shipment would route through the Eastern Trade Road, and that road ran within 5 miles of town, and Ethan had decided to check the route himself rather than take someone else's word for it. He was like that. He trusted his own eyes over other people's reports. He had stopped at the edge of the market out of mild curiosity, the noise of it, the color, and he had been about to move on when he saw the man's boot come down on the basket. He went still. He watched the woman crouch in the dirt. He watched the crowd do nothing. He watched her work steady, careful, methodical, without once raising her voice or lifting her eyes or asking a single person for help. Something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't pity. He was sure of that because pity sat outside a thing and looked down at it, and whatever he was feeling was the opposite of that. It was something that pulled, that reached, that made the distance between himself and that stall on that dusty lane feel suddenly intolerable. He dismounted. He walked across the market without exactly deciding to. His boots raised dust. The crowd parted for him because the crowd always parted for men who moved like Ethan. Caldwell moved like they expected the world to step aside, and the world, having no particular argument against it, generally did. He crouched down beside her. She didn't look up. "Let me help," he said. "I have it," she said. Her voice was flat. Not rude, just closed. The voice of someone who had stopped expecting help and reorganized their life around not needing it. "I can see that," he said. "I'm offering anyway." She looked up then. He was close enough to see that her eyes were gray and that there was something in them that wasn't quite weariness and wasn't quite exhaustion, something that had been both of those things for long enough that it had settled into something harder and quieter and more permanent. She studied his face for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to get your clothes dirty." He picked up an apple. "I'll manage." They worked side by side for a minute without talking. When the apples were gathered and the broken glass was wrapped in cloth, she stood up. He stood up. She looked at him again, really looked the way she hadn't allowed herself to before, and he could see her cataloging him. The quality of his jacket, the cut of his boots, the horse standing easy at the road's edge, which was a very good horse, better than anything in this market. "You're not from here," she said. "No, ma'am." "What's your name?" He answered, before he thought about it. And in the half-second before he spoke, something moved through his mind, a thought that arrived fully formed, as certain thoughts do, complete and immediate, and slightly unnerving in its clarity. "Jack," he said. "Jack Rowe." She accepted it. Why wouldn't she? She had no reason not to. "Abigail Mercer," she said. "Abby." "Miss Mercer." He tipped his hat. She turned back to her stall. The conversation was over, or she seemed to believe it was. She had already moved on, straightening the remaining jars, rewriting the price sign that had gotten damp in the heat. He should have walked away. He knew that. Instead, he stood there for another moment, looking at the woman who had just picked herself up out of the dirt without a word of complaint, and he thought about 12,000 acres, and about the house that had been built to last, and about all the choices he had made and never questioned. And he thought about what she had said. "You're going to get your clothes dirty," as if that were the only possible objection. As if his willingness to help was so unlikely that the most logical explanation had to be a practical mistake on his part. He thought about that for a long time after he rode away. He came back to Clover Creek 3 days later. He told himself he was checking the road again. The story was plausible enough that he didn't examine it too closely. He asked around town casually, the way a passing stranger might ask, and learned that the Mercer Orchard was 4 miles east of town on the Creek Road, that Harold Mercer had been running it for 20 years, on the labor of his daughter, that his wife had died when Abby was young, and that Abby had managed the orchard, the pressing, the market stall, and the household books without anyone asking how she managed all of it at once. He also learned from the woman at the dry goods store, who seemed eager to share, that Abby Mercer was not the marrying kind, said with a particular inflection that meant something specific and unpleasant about what the town thought of her prospects. Ethan listened to all of this with his face neutral and his jaw tight. He rode out to the Mercer Orchard that afternoon. Harold Mercer met him at the fence line. He was a lean man with a permanent squint and the handshake of someone who wanted you to know he was firm. "Looking for work," Ethan said. "I can do most anything. I'll take my keep and $1 a week." Harold looked him over. Whatever he saw, it satisfied him. "You know orchard work." "I learn fast." Harold glanced back toward the house. "My daughter handles most of the operating. You take direction from her." "That suits me fine." Harold nodded. "You can sleep in the barn. Abby'll show you where." He paused. "We had a man last year who thought direction from a woman was optional," Harold said. "He wasn't here long." Ethan held the man's gaze and said nothing, because what he was thinking was not something he was ready to say out loud to Harold Mercer. Abby was at the press when he found her. She heard him coming and turned, and when she saw who it was, something changed in her face. Not surprise exactly, but a brief rearrangement, a quick internal adjustment. "You're the new hand," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him steadily. "You helped me at the market." "I did." "Why?" The question was direct and unadorned, and he was not prepared for it. He had prepared several things to say on the ride over, but none of them had accounted for her asking why immediately and without preamble. "Because no one else was," he said. She absorbed that, turned back to the press. "The water barrel needs moving to the far side of the barn. The fence on the north line has 2 posts that need resetting. The press needs cleaning. The mechanism on the left side sticks, and if you force it, it'll strip the threading." She didn't look at him while she said this. "Don't force anything on this property without asking me first. And don't tell me something's done until it's done completely." "Yes, ma'am." "My father told you $1 a week." "He did." "I'm not raising it. But if you do the work the way it needs doing, I'll tell you so." She finally looked at him. "That's the most honesty you'll get from most employers." Ethan felt something shift, not dramatically, quietly. "That's more than most people offer," he said. She didn't smile, but something at the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "Water barrel first, then the fence." She turned back to the press. "And Jack." "Yes?" "Don't move the barrel by dragging it. You'll damage the bottom seal. Carry it." He looked at the barrel. It was 100 gallons at minimum. He was not a small man, but he was also not a man who made a habit of carrying 100-gallon barrels. "All right," he said. He carried the barrel. His back protested for 2 days afterward, and he didn't say a word about it. The work was different from anything Ethan had done. He had worked before, in the way that wealthy men sometimes work decisively on things that matter for limited durations. He gave direction. He made decisions. He signed papers that moved land and cattle and money. This was different. This was the fence post in the ground with his hands blistered. This was the press mechanism cleaned with a rag and a brush in the morning heat until the threading moved freely. This was hauling, lifting, carrying, and then doing it again the next day, because the work of an orchard did not stop. And the whole time Abby Mercer told him what he was doing wrong. Not harshly, without drama, just correctly. "You're gripping the post pounder wrong. You'll wear out your shoulder. You're stacking the crates too high on the right side. They'll tip. You filled the water bucket from the wrong channel. This one's got clay runoff after rain. You have to wait for it to clear." She never said these things to embarrass him. She said them because they were true, and the corrections mattered, and she had no particular patience for errors that would cost time. And every time, when he adjusted and did it right, she moved on without comment. No praise, no acknowledgement. Just the simple assumption that of course he had done it correctly now and they could proceed. He was not accustomed to this. He found that he didn't mind it. On the 4th evening, he was cleaning the press housing when she brought him a tin cup of water without being asked. She set it on the workbench beside him and started checking the threading on the mechanism he'd cleaned. "It moves better," she said. "You said not to force it." "I said that. Most people think that means go slow. They still push when they hit resistance." She ran her thumb along the threading. "You actually stopped." "When I hit resistance, I backed off and looked at why." She glanced at him sideways. "That's not how most men work." "Maybe most men are in too much of a hurry." She was quiet for a moment. "Where are you from, Jack?" "North," he said. The vagueness was deliberate. He hated it. But the alternative was worse, and he hadn't worked out yet how to correct the original lie without making everything more complicated than it already was. She accepted the non-answer. "You've got a manner about you," she said. "Not a laborer's manner. Is that a problem?" She thought about it with the same directness she applied to everything. "Not yet," she said. She took the press housing apart and began to clean the secondary mechanism, the one she hadn't assigned him, working with the easy practice of someone who had done this 100 times. "My father'll tell you I run this place because he lets me," she said without looking up. "In case he hasn't already." "He mentioned you handle operations. He takes the money to town. I run everything that makes the money." She set a part down and picked up another. "That's just the arrangement. Has been since my mother died. I don't say it to complain. I say it so you know how this orchard works." Ethan watched her hands move. Certain precise practiced. "I understand," he said. She looked up at him then. Really looked. The kind of looking that was less about seeing and more about determining. "Do you?" she said. He held her gaze. "I am starting to." She nodded slowly and returned to the mechanism and didn't say anything else, but she also didn't move away. And they worked side by side in the cooling evening without speaking, and it was the most honest conversation Ethan Caldwell had had in years. Outside, a mockingbird was going through its catalog of borrowed songs. The smell of the apple trees came in through the open barn door, sweet and warm. Ethan thought about the woman standing beside him, her hands dark with grease and apple press oil, explaining to him for the 4th time in 4 days exactly how something worked. Not asking for his admiration, not angling for his approval, just talking about the machinery of her own life, with the calm certainty of someone who had built it herself. He thought about the market, the basket, the apples in the dust. He thought about the name he had given her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan Caldwell felt the particular clean discomfort of a man who is not yet who he needs to be. The fifth morning changed things. Not in any way Ethan could have predicted. Not in any way that announced itself. It happened the way most real things happen quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of ordinary work. He had been at the Mercer orchard long enough that the blisters on his palms had hardened into calluses. Long enough that he knew which floorboard in the barn creaked at 4 a.m. when Abby got up to check the water lines before anyone else was awake. Long enough that Harold Mercer had stopped watching him with the sharp proprietary attention of a man assessing new equipment and had started simply ignoring him, which was how Harold Mercer treated everything he had decided was useful and therefore beneath further consideration. Ethan had made peace with being beneath further consideration. It was, in its way, a relief. What he had not made peace with was the lying. He woke up every morning in the barn with his real name sitting in his chest like a stone, and he went through the day as Jack Rowe, and at night he lay on the cot in the corner and ran the same argument with himself that he'd been running since the market. The argument went, he needed to know something true. He couldn't know something true as Ethan Caldwell, because Ethan Caldwell's name changed how people stood, how they spoke, what they offered, what they withheld. As Jack Rowe, he was seeing something real. The work was real. The people were real. Abby was real. The argument was sound. He knew it was sound. He had constructed it carefully. He also knew increasingly that it was the kind of argument a man builds when he has already done the thing he's justifying and is now simply trying to live with it. He got up at 4:15 and went to check the water lines because Abby had been doing it alone every morning, and there was no reason she should. She was already there. She heard him coming and didn't turn around. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know. I've been doing it alone for 6 years. I know that too." She turned around then. In the early dark, her face was unreadable, which he was starting to suspect was less a product of the light and more a product of deliberate practice. The expression of a woman who had learned that readable faces gave people things to use. "Why are you up at 4 a.m, Jack?" "Same reason you are. I have a reason. I own this work. You said the water lines need checking before the heat builds. If the eastern channel gets blocked by debris, the whole north row loses pressure before noon and the fruit runs small." He paused. "I remember what you tell me." Something moved across her face, brief. "Most people don't. Most people aren't paying attention." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the channel and pulled a mat of leaves from the intake screen. "South line first, then the eastern split." "Yes, ma'am." They worked through the pre-dawn without talking, moving from line to line in the dark, and Ethan thought about the fact that this was the 4th consecutive morning she had not told him to go back to sleep. She had simply allowed him to be there, which for Abby Mercer, he was beginning to understand, was its own kind of statement. The sun came up while they were checking the eastern split. She held the screen up to the light to check for blockage, and the early sun caught the edge of her face, and she squinted against it, and she said without any particular inflection, "It's going to be 100 degrees by noon." "Probably." "The Hendersons are bringing their wagon at 8 for the cider order. My father will try to manage it. Don't let him recount the order. He miscounts." "What do I do if he argues?" "Tell him I already verified it. He won't push back in front of customers." She handed him the screen. "He doesn't like looking wrong in public." Ethan held the screen and thought about Harold Mercer smashing the basket at the market and then smoothing the front of his shirt, and he thought that Harold Mercer's relationship with public appearance was considerably more complicated than Abby was making it sound. But he didn't say that. He said, "I'll handle it." She nodded and started walking back toward the barn. Then she stopped. "Why did you really come here, Jack?" He kept his face level. "I told you. Looking for work. Men looking for work go to the livery or the cattle operations north of town. Nobody thinks to come to a fruit orchard on a creek road unless someone told them about it." She watched him. "Did someone tell you about it?" "I asked around," he said carefully. "Who did you ask?" "Woman at the dry goods store." Abby was quiet for a moment. "That would be Mrs. Halsey." Another pause. "What exactly did she tell you?" He understood suddenly what she was actually asking. Not the mechanics of how he'd found the orchard, but what he'd been told about the woman who ran it. What version of Abby Mercer Mrs. Halsey had offered up to a passing stranger with idle curiosity. "She told me the orchard was east of town, and $1 a week was fair pay for the work," he said. It was not entirely untrue. Abby looked at him for a long moment. He had the uncomfortable feeling she knew exactly what he was leaving out. "All right," she said, and walked on. He stood by the eastern channel and watched her go, and he thought, this has to stop. Not the work, not being here, but the particular shape of the lie, which was getting more structural by the day, more load-bearing, harder to remove without bringing other things down with it. He thought about it all morning, which meant he was still thinking about it when the Henderson wagon arrived at 8, and Harold tried to recount the order, and Ethan said quietly and firmly, "Miss Mercer already verified the count. Mr. Mercer." And Harold's jaw tightened, but he stepped back because there were 2 Henderson men watching, and Harold did not like looking wrong in public. Abby from across the yard saw the whole exchange. She didn't nod. She didn't acknowledge it. She turned back to what she was doing. But the Henderson boy, he was maybe 14, visiting with his father, watched Ethan with open curiosity and said, "You sweet on Miss Abby?" Harold, still within earshot, went absolutely still. Ethan looked at the boy with the patience of a man who was choosing every word. "I work for Miss Mercer," he said. "She's a fair employer." The Henderson boy nodded, like this explained nothing, because it explained nothing. The Henderson father clapped his son on the shoulder and moved him along, and Harold watched Ethan for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than usual, and then walked away. That night at supper, Harold eating at the table, Abby serving, and then eating standing at the counter, as was apparently the arrangement which Ethan had noticed and said nothing about, because he understood by now that commenting on arrangements he had no power to change would only cost Abby something. Harold set down his fork and said, "The Henderson boy was running his mouth." "Boys do that," Abby said. "I don't want talk." "There's nothing to talk about." Harold looked at her. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about my own business," Abby said. Her voice was even. She did not look at Ethan. "Jack's a hand," Harold said, turning to Ethan now. "That's all. We clear on that?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Harold picked his fork back up. The conversation was closed in Harold's mind. Topics that Harold closed stayed closed apparently. He ate the rest of his meal without looking up. Abby finished at the counter and took her plate outside. Ethan helped himself to the last of the coffee, took 2 cups outside, and found her sitting on the fence at the edge of the north orchard, not eating, just holding her plate and looking at the apple trees in the last light. He handed her the cup without speaking. She took it. They sat on the fence for a while. The trees were heavy with summer fruit. Every branch was bending. "He does that sometimes," she said. "Mark's territory." "I noticed." "It's not about you specifically." "I know." She turned her head and looked at him sideways. "You're not bothered?" "By a man telling me you're off limits." He paused. "He's got the order of things wrong. That's not a conversation he gets to have." Abby was very still. "Most men," she said slowly, "would have just said yes, sir, and moved on." "I said yes, sir." "You meant something different." "Yes," he said. "I did." She turned back to the trees. He could not see her expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful in a way that it usually wasn't, measuring something. "Jack, I'm going to say something and I want you to just let me finish." "All right. I'm 31 years old. I have run this orchard since I was 17. I know what people see when they look at me, and I know what they decide, and I have stopped being surprised by any of it." She set her plate on the fence post. "I'm not looking for anything. I'm not waiting for anything. I wake up every morning at 4 and I do the work, and I go to sleep and I do it again. That is my life, and I am not complaining about it." She paused. What I am saying is, don't do something kind for me and then look for a reaction. I've had enough of that to last me." Ethan took a breath. "When have I looked for a reaction?" "You haven't, yet." "Then why are you warning me?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you're going to." He turned to look at her. She was staring at the trees. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee cup and her shoulders were absolutely still, the stillness of someone bracing for something they've already decided is coming. "Abby," he said. She didn't move. "I'm not here to practice being kind," he said. "And I'm not looking for a reaction from you. I'm looking at you because you're worth looking at, and not enough people have bothered to notice that, and it makes me—" He stopped, started again. "It makes me very tired, actually. The not noticing." A long silence. She looked at him. Her eyes in the evening light were the color of water over stone. "You're a strange man, Jack Rowe," she said. "Probably." She picked up her plate and got down from the fence. "Don't leave the press housing unlatched tonight. We'll have raccoons in the apple drops by morning." And she walked back to the house. He sat on the fence in the near dark and thought, "I have to tell her, soon, before this gets any heavier." He didn't. He didn't, because the next morning there was a problem with the eastern irrigation channel, a deeper blockage, silt and root debris, requiring half a day of clearing, and then because Luke Bennett arrived. Luke was the only person in Ethan's life who actually knew where he was. He had told Luke partly because Luke was the only person he trusted not to use the information, and partly because Luke was constitutionally incapable of not finding things funny, and Ethan had needed to tell someone before the weight of it made him humorless. Luke arrived at the Mercer orchard on a Tuesday morning in the guise of a man who was passing through and had heard there was work. He was lean and dark-haired, with a face that defaulted to amiable and concealed a great deal of sharpness underneath. And he presented himself to Harold Mercer with the particular combination of deference and capability that Harold apparently found irresistible because Harold hired him in 11 minutes. Abby was not present for this. She was at the press. Luke found Ethan behind the barn around noon, and the first thing he said was, "You look like a man who's been doing honest work for the first time in his life." "Shut up," Ethan said. "Your hands." Luke looked at them with theatrical awe. "Ethan, your hands." "I said shut up." Luke dropped the performance. "How bad is it?" Ethan put the wrench down. "Define bad." "Are you actually falling for a woman you've been lying to since the first day you met her?" Ethan said nothing, which was the loudest possible answer. Luke sat on an apple crate. "All right, so bad." "I need you here in case anything—" "In case anything happens, yes, you said. But I've known you for 12 years and you don't bring backup for logistics. You bring backup when you're doing something you know might go wrong and you want someone nearby who can think." He paused. "What's she like?" Ethan thought about the press housing and the water lines and the way she said, "Don't force anything on this property without asking me first." He thought about the fence in the evening. "And I'm not here waiting for anything, and you're going to," and the particular kind of bracing stillness in her shoulders. "She's the most competent person I've ever met," he said. Luke raised an eyebrow. "And she's been told her whole life that she's not worth looking at," Ethan said. "And she's built her entire life around needing that to not be true. And it is working mostly, and she is fine, and she has decided she is fine, and watching her be fine about it is the hardest thing I have done in a very long time." Luke was quiet for a moment. "You have to tell her." "I know. Soon? I know. Because the longer you wait—" "I know, Luke." Luke studied him. "What are you waiting for?" Ethan picked the wrench back up. "I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm here, before I go back to being who she's going to find out I am." A long pause. "That's either the most honest thing you've ever said," Luke said, "or the best excuse you've ever made." Ethan didn't answer because he didn't know which one it was either. Luke stayed. He worked the orchard with the easy adaptability of a man who had done many things in many places and picked up the requirements of each quickly. Abby assessed him in about 48 hours and assigned him the heavy hauling and the fence repair and the tasks that required brute reliability over precision. because she was, as always, exactly accurate about what she was looking at. She watched the two of them together. Once she didn't say anything, just watched, and Ethan saw her watching and knew she was filing something away. On Thursday, Harold Mercer went to town. He did this occasionally, and with a rhythm that Abby appeared to be able to predict down to the hour. He went to town. He made what he called business contacts, and what Ethan had begun to privately think of as grievances with an audience, and he came back in the evening with the particular self-satisfied expression of a man who had been listened to. The day he left, Abby worked differently. Not faster, just freer. Like a room where someone had opened a window. She laughed once at something Luke said about the apple press. It was not a big laugh, quick surprised escaping before she could decide whether to allow it. But it was real, and it rearranged her face completely, and Ethan missed his grip on the wrench and banged his knuckle on the housing. She glanced at him. "You all right?" "Fine," he said. She looked at his knuckle, which was bleeding. "That's not fine. Come here." She cleaned the cut with the water from her canteen and a strip of cloth from her apron pocket that she'd apparently been carrying for exactly this kind of contingency. Her hands were matter-of-fact about it. She held his hand by the wrist, examined the cut, cleaned it, wrapped it, and that was that. And the whole time, she did not look up at his face. "How do you always have what you need?" he said. "I paid attention to what I didn't have," she said. "Then I made sure I had it." She tied off the cloth and let go of his wrist and stepped back, and he thought, "Tell her now. Right now. Luke is 20 feet away, and Harold is in town, and this is the clearest moment there has been, and it is going to get harder, not easier." Abby. The South Press needs the secondary screen replaced this afternoon. I ordered parts last week and they came in this morning. She picked up her canteen. The threading is the same as the main housing. You know how it works. And she walked away to the South Press because Abby Mercer handled difficult moments by moving directly to the next necessary thing, and he understood that about her now, and he also understood that she had just handled him, which meant she had felt something, and decided not to feel it, which meant the moment had been real. He stood in the middle of the orchard with his bandaged hand, and thought about 12,000 acres, and about a name, and about what exactly he was building here, and what it was going to cost to tell the truth. Luke appeared at his elbow. "You're standing in the open with that face, and she's going to notice." She already noticed. Luke glanced toward the South Press. "She notice anything else?" "She notices everything," Ethan said. "Yeah." Luke was quiet. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Friday came. Harold returned from town with a different energy than usual. Tighter, purposeful, carrying something like deliberate pleasantness, which in Ethan's experience of Harold Mercer was considerably more unsettling than his ordinary variety of self-importance. He called Abby into the house after supper. Ethan was in the barn when it happened. He heard the door close. He couldn't hear words, only tone, Harold's tone, building in that particular controlled way, and Abby's tone staying flat, and then a pause, and then Harold's voice again, higher this time, and then silence. Abby came out of the house 20 minutes later. She crossed the yard and went directly to the water pump and pumped water into a bucket and stood there for a moment with her hands on the pump handle and her eyes on the ground. Ethan came out of the barn. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Abby." She looked up. In the last light, there were 2 spots of color high on her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat. "Clifford Mason is coming to dinner Sunday," she said. He waited. He's a widower. He runs the Mason cattle operation north of the Henderson place. He's 53. He has 3 children who need a woman to manage his house. She said it the way she said everything, evenly, without commentary. But underneath the evenness was something that Ethan could hear now, because he had been listening to her for 2 weeks, and he had learned how to hear what she didn't say. "My father has arranged it." "Arranged?" "A meeting, for Clifford to look." She turned back to the pump. "It's practical. My father thinks it's time I was settled. Clifford needs practical." The word practical in her mouth landed like something discarded. "You are not a practical arrangement," Ethan said. She looked at him, sharply, startled. He had said it too directly, And he knew it, but he was past the point of calibrating everything. He was looking at a woman who had just been told she was useful, and had accepted the framing automatically with that terrible practiced equanimity, and something in him would not allow it to sit there unchallenged. "You run this orchard," he said. "You know this land better than anyone alive. You get up at 4 in the morning and you make decisions that keep this whole operation breathing. You are not practical. You are the reason anything here works at all." Abby stared at him. A long silence. "Jack," she said very quietly, "be careful." "I'm not—" "Be careful," she said again, and this time there was something in it that was not a warning about him. It was something smaller, private, something she was saying to herself as much as to him. She picked up the water bucket. "Sunday dinner, 3 o'clock. She walked toward the house. "Make sure the yard is clean before then. I don't want Mason thinking we're not organized." She went inside. Ethan stood in the yard with the pump dripping beside him, and he thought about Clifford Mason. 53 years old. 3 children, house needing management. He thought about a woman who got up at 4 in the morning and carried 100-gallon barrels and bandaged other people's knuckles with cloth she kept in her pocket, just in case being looked at like a solution to somebody's domestic problem. He thought about the silk handkerchief in his inside coat pocket, the one with the Caldwell crest on the corner that he had not yet had occasion to use, but that was there always pressing against his ribs. He went to find Luke. "Mason's coming Sunday," he said. Luke looked up from the crate he was mending. "That's the cattleman who—" 3 o'clock. Harold arranged it. "Ethan?" "I know." "You need to tell her before Sunday." "I know. Because if she meets Mason and then finds out about you, Luke, the order of it is going to matter to her. You know it will." Ethan pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, against the place where the handkerchief sat in the pocket. "I know," he said. And for the first time since he had ridden into Clover Creek on a road check that had nothing to do with road checks, Ethan Caldwell was genuinely, completely afraid, not of being caught, not of exposure, not of consequence, afraid of what she would look like when she understood what he had done. Saturday passed in hard work and careful silence. Sunday morning came up hot, the way all mornings had been coming up, relentless and clear. Abby was in the kitchen before dawn. She did not bring coffee to the fence post. She did not come to the water lines. She was inside, doing whatever she did when she was preparing for something she had not asked for, and was not going to refuse, because that was how Abby Mercer moved through things that were being done to her. She managed them. She organized around them. She made them as efficient as possible, and she did not waste energy on the feeling of them. Ethan cleaned the yard. He cleaned it thoroughly because she had asked him to, and because he could do this one thing correctly, and doing it correctly felt like the closest available approximation of honesty. At 2:30, he was stacking the last of the crates when he heard the wagon on the road. Clifford Mason came into the Mercer yard the way a man comes into a property he has already in his own mind assessed. Not arrogantly, that would have been easier. Just with a quiet proprietary interest. He was a large man, gray at the temples, with the slow certainty of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions and having them stick. He shook Harold's hand. He looked around the yard. He looked at the press, at the crates, at the organized lines of orchard output. And then Abby came out of the house. She had changed into a dress that was newer, pressed a dark green that suited her in a way she probably hadn't thought about. Her hair was pinned back. She was carrying a tray with coffee, because that was what you did, because that was the form of the thing. Clifford Mason looked at her. The look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, something was calculated, assessed, and filed. He smiled. "Miss Mercer, your father speaks well of your work here." "Mr. Mason," she said. "Welcome." She poured the coffee. Ethan from across the yard watched the whole thing from behind a stack of crates he was no longer actually organizing. Clifford Mason accepted the coffee and said to no one in particular, but loud enough to carry "fine operation. A woman with head for management." He paused. "That's useful." Abby set the coffee pot down. Her hands were perfectly still. But Ethan knew by now what her stillness meant. He knew the difference between the stillness that was simply her and the stillness that was her deciding very deliberately not to let something show. He set down the crate he was holding, and he walked across the yard. He crossed the yard with no particular hurry, which was the most deliberate thing about it. Harold saw him coming, and his expression tightened. Clifford Mason turned at the sound of boots on packed dirt and looked at Ethan with the mild assessing interest of a man who catalogued other men, automatically size-bearing purpose threat level, and arrived at laborer and moved on. Ethan picked up the coffee pot from the tray. "Refill, Mr. Mason," he said. It was not what Mason expected. The question was too ordinary. It didn't give him anything to push against, and Mason was the kind of man who needed something to push against in order to know where he stood. "I'm fine," Mason said. Ethan set the pot down. He looked at Abby. "The north gate latch is giving again. You want me to reset it before evening?" It was nothing, a work question. But it did what it was designed to do. It put him in the conversation, made him a presence, and gave Abby something to look at that wasn't Clifford Mason calculating her market value. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Do that." He nodded and turned to go, and as he did, he heard Mason say to Harold in the comfortable tone of a man speaking to a peer about shared property, "You run a tight outfit. Who's the hand?" "Goes by Jack," Harold said. "Good worker. Doesn't talk much." Mason accepted this. Ethan kept walking. Behind him, he heard Mason turn back to Abby and say, "Your father tells me you've been managing the press operation yourself. That's commendable." He didn't hear Abby's answer. He was at the gate by then, crouched over the latch with a tool he didn't actually need, staying close enough to come back if he had to. Luke appeared beside him from nowhere. "How bad?" Mason looked at her like she was a line item. Ethan said, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing yet." "Ethan." "I said nothing yet." He worked the latch mechanism. "She doesn't need me to do anything. She's handling it." "She's handling it," Luke repeated. "She's always handling it. That's the problem." Ethan said nothing because Luke was right, and there was nothing useful to add to it. The dinner went an hour. Ethan did not go back into the yard during it. He stayed at the gate and then moved to the barn and worked on the press housing latch he had already repaired twice because the alternative was standing in the open where his face might give something away. At 4:15, Mason's wagon left. Ethan heard it from the barn and came to the door. Abby was standing in the yard watching the wagon go, her arms folded across her chest. Harold had already gone inside. The yard was empty, except for her and the long evening light and the coffee tray still sitting on the fence post. She stood there for a long moment after the wagon was gone. Then she picked up the tray and walked toward the house, and as she passed the barn door, she said without looking in, "The latch is fine. I checked it yesterday." She knew. Of course she knew. He came to the door. "Abby!" "I don't need managing Jack." "I know." She stopped, turned halfway. "Do you—" Her voice was quiet. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. Tired in a way that went deeper than the day. "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that he was getting better at reading, not what it was exactly, but the shape of it. The shape was something like, "I want to believe you, and I don't know if I should, and I'm very tired of not knowing." "He's going to come back," she said. "My father has decided." "What have you decided?" She looked at him like the question was in a language she had stopped expecting people to speak. "What I've decided doesn't—" She stopped, started again. "It doesn't work that way." "It should." "Jack?" She said his name like a period, like a door closing. "Go fix something that's actually broken." She went inside. He stood in the barn doorway and thought about what it meant that she had stopped herself mid-sentence. "What I've decided doesn't matter, doesn't count, doesn't change anything." He thought about which of those she had meant, and whether the answer was different depending on the day, and whether she even knew any more. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the cot in the corner of the barn and stared at the ceiling, and went through the argument again, the one he'd been running for 2 weeks, the one about knowing something true, and this time the argument fell apart before he got to the end of it. Not because the reasoning was wrong, because he had changed enough in 2 weeks that the reasoning no longer described him accurately. He got up at 2 in the morning and found his jacket and put his hand in the inside pocket and took out the handkerchief. He looked at it for a long time in the dark. The Caldwell crest was embroidered in the corner in dark blue thread. His mother had made them a set of 12 when he was young, insisting that a man ought to carry something fine, even when he didn't feel like it, because manners were what you did when you didn't feel like it. He folded it back up and put it in his pocket and lay back down. In the morning, he was going to tell her. That was the decision. Clean, final, not arguable. Morning. Before anything else. Before Harold came down, and before the water lines needed checking, and before any other thing inserted itself into the space between now and the truth. He was going to tell her. He fell asleep on that decision, which was the only version of peace available to him, and it held until 4 in the morning when he heard the wagon on the road. Not Mason's wagon. Something heavier moving fast, and sat up. The sound was wrong. He was out of the barn in 20 seconds. The wagon had stopped at the gate. 2 men were climbing down. Not men he recognized, not locals with the particular efficient movements of people who had been sent rather than arrived on their own initiative. One of them was carrying a document case. Harold Mercer was already at the gate. He had clearly been awake and waiting, which meant he had known they were coming, which meant this was not an unexpected arrival. Ethan stepped back into the shadow of the barn wall and watched. The conversation at the gate was low, brief, businesslike. Harold signed something. One of the men handed him an envelope. They shook hands. The wagon left. Harold went back inside without looking toward the barn. Ethan stood in the dark and thought that was deliberate. Whatever just happened, Harold Mercer has been planning it, and he did it at 4 in the morning because 4 in the morning is when you do things you don't want your daughter to see. He was still thinking about it when Abby came out for the water lines. She stopped when she saw him. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." She studied him briefly, then moved toward the channel. He fell into step beside her. "There was a wagon," he said. "About an hour ago." She stopped. "2 men. Your father met them at the gate. Signed something. They gave him an envelope." The quality of her stillness changed. This was not the controlled stillness. This was the stillness of someone who has just heard a sound they recognize and don't want to. "What kind of document case?" she said. "Leather, legal-looking." She was quiet for a long moment. "Was there a mark on it? A seal?" "I was too far back to see." She turned and looked at the house. Her jaw was set. Her hands were loose at her sides in the way that meant she was keeping them deliberate, because the alternative was something else. "I need to see what he signed," she said. "He went back inside." "I know where he went." She was already moving toward the house. "I know where he keeps things." Ethan followed her. "Abby." "My name is on this land," she said without slowing. "Whatever he signed at 4 in the morning, my name is on this land, and I have a right to know what's happening to it." She went into the house through the back. Ethan waited outside. He could hear movement, quiet, careful, the sounds of someone who knew exactly which drawers opened silently and which ones didn't. Then a longer silence. Then Abby came back out. She was holding a folded document. Her face was composed in the particular way that meant she was holding something together by main force. "What is it?" he said. "A lien," she said. "On the orchard." She unfolded it partially. "Chester Aldridge. He's a financier out of the county seat. My father borrowed against the property 6 months ago." She refolded it. Her hands were steady. "He didn't tell me." "How much?" She told him. The number sat in the air between them. It was not unsurvivable, but it was close. And it was 6 months old, which meant interest had been running, and the lien document had been delivered at 4 in the morning, which meant the timeline had shifted. Someone had accelerated something. "He's been in town," Ethan said. He was thinking about Harold's trips, about the self-satisfied expression he'd come back wearing, about business contacts. About what kind of business contacts arranged 4 in the morning deliveries. "He's been borrowing," Abby said, "against my work." Her voice was flat. She was containing something enormous behind that flatness. "He borrowed against this land and didn't tell me. And now Aldridge has accelerated the lien, which means someone told Aldridge to move, which means—" She stopped. "Mason," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Mason came yesterday. He looked at the operation. He knew what it was worth." Ethan worked through it. If Mason is connected to Aldridge, if he has an interest in the lien, he comes here, he confirms what the property is worth, and then the lien gets accelerated. Your father can't pay. The orchard goes to Aldridge. Mason picks it up at a fraction of its value, and your father, yours, gets to tell himself he got a fair deal," Abby said. Her voice was very quiet. "And I get to be the practical arrangement for the man who just bought my home." Silence. The thing Ethan had been containing since the moment the wagon arrived cracked open. He reached into his jacket pocket. "Abby," he said, "I have to tell you something." She looked at him, really looked the way she had that first morning at the fence, that thorough assessing look, the one that saw what was actually there, rather than what was presented. He took the handkerchief out of his pocket. He held it out. She looked at it. At the embroidered crest in the corner. She didn't touch it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Jack Rowe," she said. "No," he said. A silence that was the loudest thing he'd ever been inside. "Ethan Caldwell," he said. "My family runs 12,000 acres north of Colton. I came to Clover Creek to check a trade route. I saw you at the market. He stopped. Started again. "I told you my name was Jack because I wanted to understand something. I wanted to know if—" He stopped again because every version of the next sentence was true, and all of them sounded like exactly what they were. "I wasn't honest with you," he said, "from the first day. And I'm telling you now because I should have told you a week ago, and because what I just heard about the lien means I can help you, and I cannot offer that help as someone I'm not." Abby did not move. Her face went through something he couldn't follow, too fast, too layered, too much of it happening underneath the surface. Then she said, "You tested me." "No. You came here with a false name and watched to see what I was," she said. Her voice was controlled, precise. "You let me correct you on the water lines. You let me tell you about my father. You let me—" She stopped. Something crossed her face. She pressed her mouth shut. "Abby, you let me talk to you like you were someone I could talk to," she said. "And the whole time you were—" She gestured at the handkerchief, at everything it represented. "I was myself," he said. "Everything I said to you was true. Your name was not true. No, it wasn't. Your reason for being here was not true." He couldn't argue that. "No, so you came here," she said, "as a rich man playing poor to see if a woman like me would behave differently if she thought you had nothing." Her voice was still controlled, which was worse than if it hadn't been. "To see if I was worth something if you stripped away all the things that make men decide women are worth something. That's not me. Was I the experiment or the conclusion?" The question hit him like a hand across the face. He had no answer, not a good one. Every honest version of an answer was also a confession, and every confession he had was incomplete because he still didn't fully understand what had happened to him in the last 2 weeks. Only that it had happened, only that he was standing here in the early morning dark, holding his own name, like it was something he'd just found in the dirt, trying to give it to a woman who had every reason not to take it. "I didn't come here to test you," he said. "I came here because I couldn't stop thinking about a woman who picked herself up out of the dust without asking anyone for help, And I didn't know how to be near that as what I am. Because what I am—" He stopped. "What I am changes things. It always changes things. And I needed to know you before it changed things." Silence. Abby looked at the document in her hand, then at the handkerchief in his, then at the house where Harold Mercer was presumably sleeping, unaware that his daughter now knew what he'd done. "Get off this property," she said. "Abby, take your friend with you." Her voice didn't shake. That was the worst part. Luke, or whatever his name actually is. His name is Luke. That part. I don't care. She stepped back. "I want you off this land before my father wakes up, because if he sees you leave, he's going to want to know why, and I am not ready to have that conversation with him yet, and I need you gone before I have to manage one more thing today. Let me help with the lien." "No. Abby Aldridge is connected to Mason. If you don't move fast—" "I said no." Her voice finally cracked on that word just slightly, just at the edge. She pulled it back immediately. "I have been taking care of this land for 14 years. I will take care of this." He took a breath. "All right. Go." "I'm going." He folded the handkerchief. "But I need you to know one thing before I do." She waited. "The lien amount," he said. "I know what it is. I can cover it. Not as a favor, not as anything. Just, it's a number I can cover, and Mason and Aldridge do not get this orchard." She stared at him. "That's not a negotiation," he said. "That's not a condition. I'm telling you it's possible. What you do with that is entirely yours." She didn't say anything. He turned and walked to the barn to get Luke. Luke was awake. He'd heard the wagon too, apparently, and had been lying on his cot in the particular alert stillness of a man waiting to find out if he needed to move. When Ethan came in and said, "We're leaving," Luke was on his feet in 10 seconds. They saddled up without talking. As they rode out through the gate, Ethan looked back once. Abby was standing in the yard. She was holding the lien document in one hand, and his handkerchief he realized only now that she had taken it from him, or he had left it. He couldn't remember in her other hand looking at both of them. She did not look up as he rode out. He turned forward and rode. Luke kept pace beside him and said nothing for a long time. The road was empty. The morning was coming up hot again, the way it always came up in Clover Creek in summer, relentless and clear. "Well?" Luke said finally. "Don't," Ethan said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say I told you so." "I was going to say," Luke said carefully, "that she took the handkerchief." Ethan said nothing. "She could have handed it back," Luke said. "She didn't." The road stretched out ahead of them, empty and long. And behind them, the Mercer orchard sat in the early morning light. The apple trees heavy with summer fruit, every branch bending the press that Ethan had cleaned, and the fence he had reset and the water lines he had helped clear, before sunrise every morning for 2 weeks. 14 years, she had said. She had been running this land for 14 years. And Chester Aldridge and Clifford Mason were going to take it from her in a legal document signed at 4 in the morning by a man who had borrowed against his daughter's life without telling her. Ethan rode another half-mile before he said, "I need to know everything about Aldridge." "Already thinking about it," Luke said. "He accelerated the lien after Mason's visit. That's not coincidence." "No." "Which means Mason came to the orchard to assess not Abby, the property. He came to verify it was worth acquiring." "And Harold," Luke said slowly, "may not know he's been used." Ethan thought about that. About Harold Mercer at the gate at 4 in the morning, signing a document accepting an envelope going back inside with the self-satisfied expression of a man who has completed a transaction. Harold thought he was managing something. Harold always thought he was managing something. Harold borrowed money he couldn't repay, Ethan said. Aldridge accelerated when Mason confirmed the orchard's value. Harold probably thinks he's getting more time to pay. He has no idea the plan was never for him to pay. The plan was for him to default, Luke said. And for Mason to come in and offer Abby a very practical arrangement, Ethan said. "House children security, in exchange for signing over her claim to the property she built." Luke was quiet for a moment. "She's not going to sign." "No, she's not." "Which means Aldridge will foreclose." "Unless," Ethan said, "someone files a counter-documentation with the county seat before Aldridge moves. And unless someone takes a very close look at when exactly Harold Mercer took out that loan and what he represented about the property's ownership status when he did." Luke looked at him. "You think Harold misrepresented ownership?" "I think Harold Mercer has been telling everyone for 20 years that he runs the Mercer Orchard," Ethan said. "And I think the actual operating history of that land, the books the press records, the market accounts, everything with Abby's handwriting on it, tells a different story about who built what." He rode forward. "I need a lawyer," he said. "Today." "There's one in the county seat," Luke said. "Decent man, I know him." "Then we're going to the county seat." "And Abby." Ethan thought about the yard. The document in one hand, the handkerchief in the other. The way she'd said go without her voice shaking until the very last moment of it, and even then she'd pulled it back, because Abby Mercer did not let things show that she hadn't decided to show. "Abby is going to take care of the land," he said. "That's what she does. She takes care of things." He paused. "My job," he said, "is to make sure she has something left to take care of when it's done." They rode on. The sun climbed. The heat built early the way it always did that summer, and the road to the county seat was long and empty and straight, and Ethan Caldwell rode it with his jaw set and his hands steady on the reins, and his real name sitting in his chest. Not like a stone anymore, but like something that had been cleaned off and was finally, for the first time in 2 weeks, being used honestly. Behind him in the Mercer orchard, a woman who had run 14 years of someone else's neglect on her own 2 hands stood in the morning light and read a document that told her how close she was to losing everything. And in her other hand, she was still holding the handkerchief. She hadn't put it down. The lawyer's name was Robert Hale, and he worked out of a 2-room office above the dry goods store in the county seat, and he had the particular quality of a man who had seen enough bad paperwork to be genuinely angry when he encountered more of it. Luke had known him for 4 years. He introduced Ethan without the Caldwell name, which Ethan noticed and appreciated, because he needed Hale to look at the documents first and form an opinion before the name changed the shape of the room. Hale looked at the lean documentation for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he set it down and said, "When did you get this?" "This morning," Ethan said. "And the original loan was 6 months ago." According to the document. Harold Mercer signed as sole property owner. Hale tapped the line. "Right here. Sole owner. Sole authority." "Is that a problem for Aldridge's claim?" Hale leaned back. "Depends on what the actual ownership record says at the land office. If Harold Mercer is the recorded owner of the Mercer orchard, then his signature is valid, the lien is valid, and Aldridge can foreclose on whatever schedule he's set." He paused. "But if the land was ever recorded jointly, or if there's any documentation of the daughter's operational claim improvements, she financed contracts, she signed tax payments, she made in her own name, then Harold's representation of sole ownership may constitute fraud on the loan instrument." Ethan looked at Luke. Luke looked back with the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic. "How long to check the land office record?" Ethan said. "I can have it this afternoon," Hale said. "But the operating history, the daughter's financial involvement, that takes documentation. You'd need her account books, her signed contracts, any payment receipts in her name." He paused. "You'd need her." Ethan already knew that. What he didn't know was whether she would let him. He sent a message to the Mercer orchard through a boy from the livery, not a letter, because a letter took too long and could be intercepted by Harold. A message. 4 words. Hale. County seat. Today. He included the address and nothing else. Then he waited. Hale went to the land office. Luke went to find food. Ethan sat in the 2-room office above the dry goods store and thought about the look on Abby's face when she'd seen the handkerchief, that thorough, terrible rearrangement. And he thought about, was I the experiment or the conclusion? And he thought about the fact that the only honest answer to that question was that she had been neither. That he had arrived at the Mercer orchard looking for something he couldn't name and had found something he hadn't expected, which was a woman who made him feel like the least complete version of himself he'd ever been, not because she diminished him, but because she was so entirely herself that standing next to her revealed every way he wasn't. He had been Ethan Caldwell for 34 years. He knew the shape of that. He knew what it required and what it provided and where its edges were. He had never before 2 weeks on a fruit orchard in Clover Creek understood that knowing the shape of yourself was not the same as knowing what you were made of. Hale came back at 2 o'clock. The land was recorded in 1871 in the name of Harold Thomas Mercer, he said, setting the folder on the desk. Single owner. Wife was never added. Daughter was never added. He opened the folder. However, and this is where it gets interesting, in 1879, Harold Mercer filed an agricultural improvement declaration which was required under the County Development Ordinance at the time. The declaration lists the press installation, the irrigation expansion, and the orchard replanting as capital improvements. He turned the page. The contractor receipts attached to that declaration are signed by Abigail Ruth Mercer, not Harold. Abigail, as the contracting party. Ethan leaned forward. She paid for the improvements, Hale said, in her own name, which means she has an equitable interest in the property regardless of what the deed says, because you cannot make capital improvements to land in your own name and with your own funds without acquiring some form of claim. He looked up. Harold Mercer may own the deed, but Abigail Mercer built what the deed is worth. The door opened. Abby walked in. She had ridden fast. There was dust on her jacket and she'd come alone, which meant she'd left before Harold was awake enough to ask questions, and she'd made 4 miles on horseback in time that suggested she had not gone slowly. She stopped when she saw Ethan and something moved through her face and she put it away in the same motion. She looked at Hale. You're the lawyer. Robert Hale, ma'am. What do you have? Hale told her. He was precise about it, which was the right instinct. Abby did not want to be managed through information. She wanted the information clean. She stood at the corner of the desk and listened and asked 2 clarifying questions and did not look at Ethan at all. When Hale finished, she said, What do I need to file? An equitable claim based on the improvement documentation. We attach the contractor receipts, your account books if you have them, any market contracts signed in your name. We file it at the land office before Aldridge moves to foreclose, which, he checked the lien document again, he can legally do in 11 days. I have the account books, Abby said. 7 years of them. Every transaction, every receipt, every contract. I kept them because I was the one who could answer questions about them. She paused. I can have them here tomorrow morning. That's enough time, Hale said. If we file by end of week, Aldridge's foreclosure is contested, and a contested foreclosure on a fraudulent loan representation. If we can prove Harold misrepresented ownership, buys you months, possibly voids the lien entirely. Abby nodded. 1 nod clean. Then we file by end of week. She finally looked at Ethan. He had not spoken since she'd walked in. He'd made a deliberate decision about that she didn't need him to manage this, she needed him to not be in the way of it, and he had held to that, and now she was looking at him with an expression that he could not entirely read. You sent for me, she said. I did. You could have explained the legal situation in the message. I could have, he said. I wanted you to hear it from Hale, not from me. A pause. Why? Because you had a reason not to trust what I tell you, he said, and Hale doesn't have that problem. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at Hale. What's your fee? We can discuss. I want to know now. Hale told her. It was fair, not cheap. She nodded again, the same single nod, and said, I'll bring the books tomorrow at 8. She turned to leave. Abby, Ethan said. She stopped. Her back was to him. Mason, he said. He's connected to Aldridge. We think he came to the orchard to assess the property, not for the other thing. Your father doesn't know. Harold thinks he's managing a debt situation. He doesn't understand he's been positioned. A long pause. "I know," she said. She walked out. He followed her into the hall. She was at the top of the stairs, and she turned when she heard him, and she held up one hand, not a stopping gesture, more like wait. "Let me," and then she lowered it. "My father didn't do this on purpose," she said. "He did it stupidly, greedily. He borrowed money he shouldn't have, and he let himself be flattered by men who knew what they were doing, and now he thinks it's going to work out because it always works out." She was staring at the wall. "He's been wrong about things his whole life, and they've worked out because I've been there to make them work out." Ethan waited. "This one," she said. "I'm making work out for me." She looked at him. In the dim hallway, her eyes were very clear. "The equitable claim is mine," she said. "My documentation, my books, my work. If Hale can make the filing, that orchard stays mine. Not my father's. Mine." Her jaw was set. "I have 14 years of receipts that say so." "Yes," Ethan said. "You do. I don't need your money for this." "I know. I don't want your money for this. I'm not offering it for this." She went still. "Then what are you offering it for?" "The lien amount," he said. "After the filing. If the equitable claim complicates Aldridge's position, but doesn't void the underlying debt, and it may not, the loan itself may be legitimate, even if the ownership representation wasn't, there's still money owed. I can pay it." "Why?" The word was a question, but it landed like a statement. "Because Harold borrowed against your work," Ethan said. "And you shouldn't have to spend the next 10 years paying off a debt that was taken out on your name without your consent." "It wasn't taken out on my name. It was taken out on your land. Same thing." She was quiet. Her hands were at her sides, perfectly still, which he now understood was not calm. It was the thing she did, instead of reaching for something or pulling away from something, the physical discipline of keeping herself contained when what she felt was too large for the space available. "You lied to me for 2 weeks," she said. "Yes." "You let me trust you as someone you weren't." "Yes. And now you're asking me to let you—" She stopped. "What are you asking exactly? Because you said the money wasn't a condition. You said it wasn't a negotiation. So what is it?" He thought about it. He thought about every answer that was a version of what he wanted, which was too much to say and too soon to say it, even if it wasn't. He thought about the fence post at evening, and her hands on the press housing, and the coffee cup she'd brought without being asked, and the way she'd said, "You're going to get your clothes dirty," not as a joke, but as a genuine practical assessment of a situation. As though the only possible thing a wealthy man could want when crouching in the dirt of a market was doing her a favor accidentally. "It's not anything you owe me," he said. "It's something I owe you. For 2 weeks of your time and your trust and the things you told me that you wouldn't have told Ethan Caldwell." He held her gaze. "I can't pay that back. But I can make sure Aldridge doesn't get this orchard, and that's what I'm going to do, and you can be angry at me while I do it." A long silence. "I am angry at you," she said. "I know. I'm not finished being angry at you. I'm not asking you to be." She looked at him, that thorough assessing look, the one that saw what was actually there. He held still under it. He had nothing to hide anymore, and he wasn't going to perform anything for her benefit. He was just going to be what he was and let her see it, because that was the only honest thing available to him now. "Bring the books tomorrow," she said finally. 8 o'clock. She turned for the stairs. "You can be here for that." It wasn't forgiveness. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. But it was a door that hadn't been fully closed, and he was going to be careful with it. He went back to Hale's office and spent the rest of the afternoon going through everything Hale could find on Chester Aldridge. What they found was not surprising exactly, but it was thorough. Aldridge had done this before, not with orchards, but with the same basic structure. He found leveraged property, identified an operational party whose name wasn't on the deed, arranged an accelerated default, and came in with a buyer ready. The buyer was usually someone who wanted the property for reasons adjacent to the stated ones. Mason wanted the northern acreage for cattle expansion almost certainly. The orchard itself was secondary, but the creek rights that came with it were not. The Mercer orchard sat on Clover Creek. Whoever owned the orchard owned the water rights for a quarter-mile of viable grazing land that Mason had been trying to access for 3 years. This was never about Abby, Luke said. It was never about Harold either, Ethan said. It was about the creek. The orchard was the vehicle. And Mason sending himself as the suitor was insurance. If the legal route took time, he wanted a personal route available. Ethan set the papers down. He looked at her like a line item because that's exactly what she was to him. A signature on a deed transfer that he could get one way or another. Luke was quiet for a moment. She's going to want to know this. She already suspects it. Knowing and suspecting are different things. When she knows... Luke paused. She's going to want to go back and understand every moment of that dinner with different eyes. Ethan thought about Abby standing in the yard after Mason left, arms folded, watching the wagon go. The controlled stillness, the way she'd gone to the water pump and stood with her hands on the handle. She had already known on some level. She had known it wasn't about her. She had just been hoping she was wrong. He hoped she had not spent long hoping that. Morning came. Abby arrived at Hale's office at 7:55 with a canvas satchel that held 7 years of account books, each one labeled on the spine in her careful, even handwriting. She set them on Hale's desk and stood back and said, "The 1876 book has water damage on the first 20 pages, but the entries are still legible. The 1879 contractor receipts are in the back pocket of that book specifically because I thought I might need them someday, and I wanted them accessible." Haley looked at the satchel with the expression of a man who had spent his career looking at people's paperwork and had just encountered something unusually well organized. "You kept these in case of a legal dispute." "I kept them," Abby said, "because I kept everything. Because this land was always going to need defending, and I knew the defense would be in the details." She paused. "I just didn't know I'd be defending it from my own father." The room went quiet. She had said it without drama, just fact, just the plain truth of what was happening stated cleanly the way she stated everything. Hale opened the 1879 book and found the contractor receipts and read them for 4 minutes, and then said, "Miss Mercer, these are remarkably clear. The contracting authority is entirely yours. The payment records are consistent. If these hold up to scrutiny, and they will, because the county records will match Harold Mercer misrepresented material ownership facts when he took out this loan. Then file," she said. "I'll have it drafted by this afternoon. You'll need to sign. I'll be here." She turned to go and stopped because Ethan was by the door, and she looked at him with that expression again, the one he couldn't entirely read, the layered one, the one that was several things at once. "The creek rights," she said. He was not surprised she'd gotten there. "Yes. That's what Mason wanted. We believe so. He was never—" She stopped, let out a slow breath. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise, the particular exhale of someone whose worst reading of a situation has just been confirmed. "He sat at my table and drank my coffee and assessed my orchard," she said. "And what he was actually doing was counting water rights." "Yes. And my father—" She stopped again. "My father doesn't know." "We don't think so." "No." She was quiet. "He wouldn't have agreed to something that—" She pressed her mouth shut. Then, "He's not a cruel man. He's a stupid man. Those are different." "They are," Ethan said. "He's going to be humiliated when this comes out. He made choices that led here." "I know that," she said sharply. "I know that. I'm not defending him. I'm—" She exhaled again. "I'm going to have to be the one who tells him, because if he hears it from anyone else, he'll find a way to make it a different story, and I need him to understand what actually happened." She looked at Ethan. "You are not going to be there when I do that." "I wasn't planning to be." "Good." She picked up the satchel. "I'm coming back at 3 to sign the filing. Don't—" She stopped, looked at him one more time. Something shifted barely perceptible in the set of her jaw. "Don't be somewhere else when I come back." She left. Luke, from the corner where he'd been very quietly present throughout, said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "Don't be somewhere else when I come back." "I heard her." "Ethan, she just asked you to stay." "I know. That's not nothing." "I know, Luke." Luke looked at the door she'd gone through, then back at Ethan with the expression of a man who had watched something important happen and was privately relieved by it. "She's going to make you work for it," he said. "She should," Ethan said. He sat down for the first time in 2 days and felt something in his chest unclench. Not fully, not the way it would eventually, but enough to breathe against. Enough to think clearly. He had one more thing to do before 3 o'clock. He needed to find Chester Aldridge, not to threaten, not to make demands. But because Chester Aldridge was going to receive Hale's filing and make a calculation, and Ethan wanted to be the one who gave him the full picture of what that calculation looked like before he made it wrong. He asked Hale for Aldridge's office address, which Hale gave him with the expression of a man who had questions and was choosing not to ask them. He rode to the address alone. Aldridge's office was on the main street of the county seat 2 floors up, in a building that announced itself with quiet confidence the kind of office that existed to make people understand, before they sat down, what kind of position they were in. Ethan walked in and gave his real name. The receptionist's expression changed immediately. He was shown in within 4 minutes. Chester Aldridge was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had learned early that how you held yourself was a form of leverage. He looked at Ethan across the desk with the particular attention he probably reserved for people who arrived unannounced, and gave names that warranted being shown in immediately. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I wasn't aware you had interests in this county. I've been developing some," Ethan said. He sat down without being invited. "I want to talk about the Mercer Orchard lien." A pause, very slight. "I have various instruments in this county. I'm not sure which. The one you accelerated yesterday," Ethan said, after Clifford Mason visited the property. The pause this time was longer. "That's a private financial matter," Aldridge said. "It is," Ethan said. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully, because this is the kind of information that changes what a smart man does next." He leaned forward. Harold Mercer misrepresented the property's ownership status when he took out that loan. His daughter has 7 years of documentation proving equitable interest. Robert Hale is filing a claim this afternoon that will tie your lien in contested court proceedings for as long as it takes. During which time Mason doesn't get his water rights, you don't get your foreclosure fee, and everyone in this county with a financial instrument through your office is going to hear about the Caldwell name being associated with the opposing side of a dispute with you. Aldridge was very still. "Alternatively," Ethan said, "you forgive the lien. In exchange for which I don't pursue the fraudulent representation angle. Harold Mercer doesn't face a fraud charge, Mason finds his water rights some other way, and this entire situation concludes quietly." He paused. "I will also place a significant portion of my operating accounts through your institution, which I suspect is worth considerably more to you than a fruit orchard on a creek road." A long silence. Aldridge looked at him with the eyes of a man recalculating. "You have feeling for the Mercer woman," he said. "I have feeling for legal instruments being used to steal from people who built something," Ethan said. "The Mercer woman is a separate matter." Another pause. Then Aldridge said, "I'll need the offer in writing." "Hale will have it to you before end of day," Ethan said. "The filing holds until I confirm you've signed." He stood up. "Mr. Caldwell," Aldridge said, "you came here as a hand on that orchard. Word gets around." Ethan looked at him. "It does," he said. "Word also gets around about what kind of man honors a quiet resolution and what kind doesn't. I'm giving you the opportunity to be the first kind." He left. He rode back to Hale's office and told him what had been offered and what needed to be drafted, And Hale looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was not quite professional neutrality, and said, "She doesn't know you did this." "She knows I was going to try," Ethan said. "She told me not to do it for the wrong reasons." "And what reasons are you doing it for?" Ethan thought about the market, the apples in the dust, the woman who had picked herself up without asking for help, and the man who had watched from the edge of the road and felt the distance between himself and that moment as something intolerable. "The right ones," he said, "I think." At 3 o'clock exactly, Abby walked back through the door. She looked at Ethan first, and something in her face shifted when she found him there. Something small and not quite hidden, and she looked away immediately and said, "Is it ready?" "It's ready," Hale said. She signed. Her handwriting was careful, and even the same as the price sign at the market, the same as 7 years of account books, certain without flourish exactly what it needed to be. When she set the pen down, Ethan said, "I spoke to Aldridge." She looked up. "He may agree to forgive the lien," Ethan said, "in exchange for my accounts going through his institution. It's a business arrangement. Nothing you're obligated to." She stared at him. "You did that without telling me," she said. "I did it this morning, before you signed, so that if you wanted nothing to do with it, the filing still protected you." "You went to Aldridge." "I gave him a reason to choose the smarter option," Ethan said. "Whether he takes it or not, the filing stands. Your claim stands. The orchard is yours regardless." Abby looked at the signed document on Hale's desk, then at Ethan, then at the document again. "You gave him your accounts," she said, "to protect my land." "I gave him a business offer," Ethan said, "which happened to also protect your land." She was quiet for a very long moment. "Ethan," she said. It was the first time she had said his real name. He went very still. She looked at him with that expression, the layered one, and he could see her deciding something. He could see the weight of it, the care she was taking, the particular precision she applied to everything, including this. "I have to go home," she said. "I have to talk to my father." "I know. And I need—" She stopped. "I need some time, before anything else." "You have it," he said. "Whatever you need." She picked up the empty satchel. Her hand was on the door when she turned back one last time. "The handkerchief," she said. He waited. "I still have it," she said. She walked out. 3 days passed without a word from the Mercer orchard. Ethan stayed in the county seat. He and Luke took a room above the tavern, and Ethan worked not orchard work, but the kind of work that had his name on it, the kind he'd been neglecting for 3 weeks while he carried barrels and reset fence posts and learned what it felt like to earn $1. He wrote letters to his foreman. He reviewed the trade route documentation that had originally brought him to Clover Creek. He went through Hale's updates on the filing, which were methodical and encouraging. The equitable claim had been received. The land office had confirmed the contractor receipts matched county records, and Aldridge had gone quiet, which Hale said was a good sign. Ethan read every update and thought about Abby sitting across a table from her father, saying the things that needed to be said. He did not let himself think too far past that. On the second day, Luke said, "You should eat something that isn't coffee." "I ate breakfast 3 hours ago, and you've been staring at that letter for 40 minutes without writing anything on it." Ethan set the pen down. She said she needed time. She did. "I'm giving her time." "You are," Luke said. "You're also wearing a hole in the floor between that desk and the window." Ethan looked down. He had not been aware he was pacing. He sat. "What did Harold do?" he said when she told him. "You don't know that she's told him yet. She told him the first night." Ethan was certain of this in the way he was certain of things about her now, not from evidence, but from understanding the shape of how she moved through hard things. She would not have waited. Waiting was not how Abby Mercer handled something that needed handling. She told him and he argued, and she showed him the documentation, and he had to sit with being wrong in a way he couldn't reshape into something else. Luke was quiet for a moment. And then she took care of it," Ethan said. The way she takes care of everything." On the third morning, a boy arrived at the tavern with a note. It said, "The press needs the secondary seal replaced. The parts are in the barn. You know where they go. Nothing else. No signature." But the handwriting was careful and even, and Ethan knew exactly whose it was before he finished reading the first word. He looked at Luke. Luke was already standing up. They rode to the Mercer orchard in the early morning, arriving before the heat built. The gate was open. The yard was quiet. Ethan went directly to the barn, found the seal parts on the workbench, exactly where she'd said they'd be, and got to work. He had been at it for 20 minutes when he heard her footsteps. She came into the barn and stood to the side and watched him work. She didn't speak. He didn't stop. He kept his hands on the housing, kept working through the replacement because she hadn't come to talk yet, and he understood that. When the seal was fitted and the housing latched, he straightened. She was leaning against the barn wall with her arms crossed, watching him with that expression, not the closed one, not the layered one. Something newer, something that hadn't finished forming yet. "I told my father," she said. "I know. He didn't believe me at first. About Mason, about Aldridge." She paused. "He thought I was exaggerating. He thought Clifford Mason was a decent man who had a practical situation and had made a respectful approach through proper channels." Her jaw tightened briefly. "He said I was too hard on men." Ethan kept his face still. "I showed him the lien document," she said. "I showed him the contractor receipts. I showed him what Hale filed." She looked at the barn floor. "He was quiet for a long time. My father is almost never quiet. It was the loudest thing I've ever heard." Ethan waited. "He said he didn't know Mason was connected to Aldridge," she said. "I believe him. He's not a complicated man. He borrowed money because he wanted more than he had, and he didn't tell me because he knew I'd say no, and he thought it would work out because it always works out." She exhaled. "He cried." A pause. "I haven't seen him cry since my mother died," she said. Ethan said nothing because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. "He's going to have to live with what he did," she said. "I'm not going to make that easy for him, but I'm also not—" She stopped. "He's my father. He's a stupid man who loves me in the limited way he's capable of, which mostly looks like taking credit for my work and making decisions without asking me. But he didn't set out to destroy what I built. He was just careless with it." Her voice was even. "I know the difference." "That's more generosity than most people would have," Ethan said. "It's not generosity, it's accuracy." She finally looked up from the floor. "I don't see the point in deciding he's something worse than he is. He's exactly what he is. I've always known what he is. I had hoped he might surprise me." The honesty of it landed quietly. No performance, no self-pity. Just the plain truth of a woman who had measured something clearly and found it came up short and was deciding how to live with the measurement. "Did Aldridge sign?" she said. "Hale got confirmation yesterday evening," Ethan said. "The lien is forgiven. Harold owes nothing." She absorbed that. "And Mason? He's moved his attention elsewhere. The water rights negotiation is going to take him longer. Now there's another parcel north of Henderson's that he's apparently been looking at. He's not coming back here." She nodded. One nod. "Good." She pushed off the barn wall and walked to the press housing, the one he'd just repaired, and ran her hand along the seal. Checking his work, the way she always checked everything, not because she doubted him, but because verification was how she stayed in control of her own operation. He knew that now. He didn't take it personally. "It's right," she said. "I know how to do it now," he said. "You showed me." She turned. "I showed Jack Rowe. Jack Rowe had my hands," he said, "and my back, and my—" He paused. "Everything I told you as Jack Rowe was true. I want you to know that. I know the name was wrong, but nothing else was." She looked at him steadily. "You told me you were from the north," she said. "I am." "You told me you learned fast." "I do." "You told me you came because you asked around." A pause. "Which was true." Yes. You told me. She stopped, looked at the press, then back at him. You told me that what I decided should matter. That it was a conversation my father didn't get to have. Her voice was quieter. You meant that. I meant every word of it. She was still for a moment. Then she said, I was angrier at you than I've been at anyone in a long time. I know. Angrier than at Aldridge. Angrier than at Mason. I know that too, because Aldridge and Mason were exactly what they appeared to be. They wanted something, and they tried to take it. She met his eyes. You were something I didn't expect, and then you weren't. And I had to. She stopped, pressed her hand flat on the press housing. I had to go back through every conversation and look at it differently. Every morning at the water lines, every evening on the fence, the barn, the seal, She stopped again. It's a strange feeling, deciding whether two true things can exist at the same time. What two things? That you lied to me, she said, and that everything you showed me was real. The barn was very quiet. Ethan took one step toward her, just one, because she was still deciding, and he was not going to rush what she was deciding. Are you still angry? He said. She thought about it with the same directness she brought to everything. Yes, she said. Some. All right. I'm going to be some angry for a while. That's fair. It doesn't go away just because you fixed the lien and the press seal and rode out here at 7 in the morning, she said. But something in her voice had shifted just slightly towards something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite its opposite, but was something in between that had the quality of a door not fully closed. I'm not here because I fixed anything, he said. I'm here because you sent for me. She looked at him. A long look. The thorough kind. I sent for you, she said slowly, because the seal needed replacing. The seal could have waited 3 days, he said. You know that. She held his gaze. Then she looked away first, which was something she almost never did, and the fact of it told him more than anything she'd said. I need to go check the north line, she said. I'll come. I didn't ask you to come. You didn't tell me to stay either. She looked at him sideways. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Brief. Real. The same quick, surprised thing he'd seen that day Harold went to town, the laugh that escaped before she decided whether to allow it. She walked out of the barn. He followed her. They walked the north line together, checking the channel intake screens, the way they had every morning for 2 weeks, moving from point to point without rushing. And this time, there was something different about the silence between them. Not the careful silence of two people managing what they felt, but the easier silence of two people who had said enough of the hard things that the quiet no longer needed to work so hard. At the second intake screen, she said, Hale's filing. My name is on the equitable claim. It is. If it holds, and he thinks it will, the orchard's ownership status is going to have to be formally resolved. Harold and I will need to settle what the deed reflects. Do you know what you want it to reflect? She pulled a mat of leaves from the intake. My name. Both our names, maybe because he is still my father, and this was his land first, but my name on it, so that the next time someone wants to borrow against it or sell it or give it away, I have to sign too. That's right, Ethan said. That's exactly right. She glanced at him. You sound like you've been thinking about this. I have. Why? He took the intake screen from her and checked it against the light. Because I've been thinking about what you should have, he said. And a name on the deed is something you should have had 14 years ago. She was quiet. He handed the screen back and she refitted it without looking at him. Ethan, she said. He turned. Why did you really come back this morning? The question was not what it seemed. She wasn't asking about this morning specifically. She was asking something larger, the same question she'd been asking since the barn, since the note she'd sent, since the handkerchief she'd taken and kept. She was asking him to say it plainly, without the intermediary of fixing things, or offering legal resources, or arriving with useful information. She was asking him what he was here for at the bottom of it, The thing underneath all the things. He had been thinking about how to answer this since the moment he rode out of her yard with Luke at his side, and her standing in the morning light behind him. He had drafts of the answer that were eloquent. He had discarded all of them. "Because I don't want to be somewhere you're not," he said. Silence. "That's simple," she said. "It is." "You have 12,000 acres." "Yes." "You have a house." "Yes." "And a name that opens doors." "Yes." "And you're standing on a creek line at 7 in the morning clearing intake screens," she said, "because you don't want to be somewhere I'm not." "Yes," he said. "That's it exactly." She looked at him for a long time. The sun was coming up harder now, the way it did every morning, that summer heat building early and relentless, and she was squinting slightly against it, and her hair was coming loose from its pin, and her hands were wet from the creek, and she looked exactly like a woman who had been up since 4 in the morning doing the work of her own land, and she was the most real thing Ethan Caldwell had ever stood close to. "I'm not a practical arrangement," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. I'm not going to be easier because you're wealthy." "I know. I'm going to keep running this orchard the way I run it. I'm going to get up at 4 in the morning, and I'm going to check the water lines, and I'm going to tell you when you're doing something wrong." "I'm counting on it," he said. "I'm still some angry," she said. "I know. And I'm not going to pretend I'm not." She looked at him directly. "But I've been standing here for 10 minutes, and you haven't tried to manage any of that. You haven't explained it away, or apologized around it, or tried to make it smaller than it is." "It's not smaller than it is," he said. "I lied to you. That's real. Your anger at it is real. I'm not trying to talk you out of something real." She was quiet for a moment. "The handkerchief," she said. "You still have it." "I do." She met his eyes. "I could have given it back in the hallway. You left it on the ground. I picked it up. I told myself I was going to return it." "But you didn't." "I didn't." She paused. "I kept it because I was angry, and I wanted to have something of yours to be angry at." Another pause. "And then I kept it for different reasons." Ethan held still. "What reasons?" he said. She looked at the creek. At the intake screen she'd just refitted. At the orchard stretching out around them, heavy with summer fruit. Every branch bending with the weight of what had been grown here over 14 years of early mornings and careful hands, and a woman who had decided the work was worth doing, even when no one was watching. "Because it's fine," she said simply. "Because you told me your mother made them. Because you've had it in your pocket every single day. You were here next to your real name, and you were ashamed of both." She looked at him. "I kept it because it was the truest thing about you that I had." Something in his chest broke open quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket. He held out his hand. She looked at what he was holding. Not the handkerchief, she had that. He was holding his hand out, palm up, empty. Just the offer of it. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she put hers in it. Her hand was rough and cool from the creek water, and her grip was firm, not tentative, not uncertain, the grip of a woman who made decisions and held to them, who had considered the weight of a thing and chosen to pick it up. They stood on the north line of the Mercer orchard while the summer sun climbed and the creek ran and the apple trees bent with their own fullness, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say that the held hands didn't already say better. After a while, she squeezed his hand once and let go. "The east line needs checking," she said. "I know. And the press needs a full cycle run before noon to check the new seal. I'll do it. After that," she paused, glanced at him sideways. "After that, I think my father would like to know who you actually are. He's been asking." "What have you told him?" "I told him you were the man who helped me at the market," she said. He remembered. He remembered better than I thought he would. A pause. "He said you looked like someone with land." He wasn't wrong. "He's rarely wrong about that kind of thing," she said. "He's wrong about almost everything else, but he can read a man's boots." She started walking toward the east line. "He's going to want to talk to you about the cattle trade route. He's going to try to make it seem like it was his idea that you came here." "I'll let him," Ethan said. She looked back at him. "You don't have to. I know. But it costs me nothing, and it gives him something to stand on." He fell into step beside her. "You said he's not a cruel man." "He's not." "Then let him have the story he can live with," Ethan said. "The real one is yours. You don't need him to tell it correctly." She was quiet for a few steps. "You understand things," she said. "You've been teaching me," he said. She made a sound that was almost the laugh, the real one, the quick surprised one, and didn't quite let it go, but it was close, and he knew it was close, and that was enough for now. They checked the East Line together. Then they ran the press cycle. Then Abby made coffee, and she brought 2 cups, and she set one on the fence post beside Ethan, the same way she had on the mornings when she had begun without deciding to trust him. And she took the other cup for herself, and stood next to him. And they drank their coffee in the morning heat, and watched the orchard. Harold Mercer came out of the house at 8:30, saw Ethan, and went very still. Then he straightened his shirt the way he always did when he was composing himself and walked over. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Abby. Then he said to Ethan, "My daughter says you're Caldwell. Out of Colton." "Yes, sir." Harold absorbed this. "You worked my orchard for 2 weeks as a hand." "I did." Another pause. Harold looked at his daughter again, reading something in her face, and whatever he found there settled something in him. He looked back at Ethan. "She's not easy," he said. "No, sir," Ethan said. "She's not. She's going to run this place the way she sees fit, and she's not going to ask your opinion about it. I know. And she's going to be right more than she's wrong, which is going to bother you sometimes." "It won't," Ethan said. "I've been wrong enough lately that I find it restful when someone around me is right." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite approval, and was probably the closest Harold Mercer got to either. "Coffee's inside," he said to no one in particular, and went back to the house. Abby watched him go. "He likes you," she said. "He's reserving judgment." "That's what liking looks like on him," she said. Ethan looked at her. She was watching the house, her coffee cup in both hands, and she was not smiling exactly, but the set of her face was different from anything he'd seen on it before. Not the controlled stillness, not the careful evenness, but something quieter and more settled, something that had found a place to be. "Abby," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to need to go back to Colton," he said. "Not today, but in a few weeks. There are things I've been neglecting." She nodded. No alarm, no reading into it. "And I'm going to come back," he said. "I know," she said. "Not to fix anything, not to manage anything, just to—" "I know," she said again. He looked at her. She was looking at the orchard, at the trees, heavy with what she had grown at the land that now had her name attached to it in a legal document filed at the county seat at the creek that ran along the northern edge, carrying the water rights that Clifford Mason had wanted and would not have. She had built all of it. She had defended all of it. She had stood in the dirt of a Saturday market and picked up every piece of what had been knocked down without asking a single person for help, and she had done it without losing a gram of her dignity. And she had been doing that her whole life, and she was going to keep doing it, and the man standing next to her was not going to be the thing that changed any of that. He was just going to be the man standing next to her while she did it. And that Ethan Caldwell understood was the only thing worth being. Months later, the Clover Creek Market ran its fall session, and Abby Mercer set up the fruit stall the way she always had crates arranged. Jars aligned prices written on brown paper in careful, even handwriting. She did it alone because she was capable of it alone and always had been. The difference was that the deed filed at the county land office now carried 2 names on the ownership line, and the second name had been added not by Harold Mercer's signature, but by a legal resolution that recognized 14 years of receipts and contracts and account books kept by a woman who had understood long before anyone else did that the defense of a thing lives in its details. And when a man on a good horse came through the gate at 9 in the morning and dismounted and walked to the stall and picked up an apple from the arrangement without asking, Abby looked at him and said, "You're going to smudge the display." "I know," Ethan Caldwell said. "You always do. You always let me." She took the apple from his hand, replaced it precisely where it had been, and looked at him with that expression, the one that wasn't quite the laugh, but was everything just before it, the one that had taken him 2 weeks to earn the first time, and that he intended to keep earning every morning for as long as she would let him. "The press seal is holding," she said. "Good," he said. "You did that right. You showed me how." She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her eyes was not the wariness he had first seen there, and not the careful distance, and not the anger, and not even the deciding. It was something that had come through all of those things and arrived somewhere on the other side, somewhere clear and steady and certain. The way everything was when Abigail Mercer finally made up her mind. "Yes," she said, "I did." And that was the whole truth of it. Not the richest man in 3 counties choosing the woman no one had chosen, not a rescue, not a transaction, not a test with a conclusion. Just a woman who had built something real, and a man who had finally learned to see it, and the long patient work of 2 people deciding that what they had found in each other was worth every difficult, honest, necessary thing it had taken to get there. Some loves begin when you have everything. This one began when a man had the good sense to put everything down, pick up an apple crate, and pay attention.